Hi everyone, my name is Renat. I'm with Altoros, and please meet Cornelia Davis from Pivotal. Today we're gonna share with you the Cassandra on top of Cloud Foundry, what kind of benefits it can bring to a developer, and what Cloud Foundry is about, and how you can use it to make your life easier. So we'll start with a brief introductions of what our companies and what the backgrounds. My background is in professional services, the company Altoros, which I started as a one-man shop 10 years ago, and now we're focusing on deploying and managing Hadoop, NoSQL solutions, and very recently we started a Cloud Foundry practice that we're putting together. And perhaps Cornelia could introduce Pivotal.
Sure. Is this on? Yes?
No.
Yes, okay. I'm getting it. Oh, there we go. Now it's on. Very briefly, is anybody familiar with the Pivotal company? Okay, I see a couple of people saying no and a few saying yes. So very quickly, you can see from bottom to top here, we go from very concrete stuff, cloud storage, EMC's world, virtualization, VMware's world, and then there's a whole bunch of assets that layer on top of those. Some of those you might be familiar with, like Greenplum, come from the EMC side of the business, and Cloud Foundry is one of those things that comes from the VMware side of the business. If you'll click to the next slide, what Pivotal company is about those top three layers that I showed on the screen. It's a separate company owned by VMware EMC and General Electric. General Electric has also done a sizable investment in it. So that's the Pivotal company.
Great, thanks, Cornelia. Why Cloud Foundry? Why is it here? Why are we talking about it? To my view, the main beneficiaries of platform as a service in general and Cloud Foundry specifically are the developers. And instead of waiting, you can just deploying. And the main point of why use Cloud Foundry for developers is to separate the notion of developing an application and deploying it and scaling it. And so the Cloud Foundry is a collection of, as I would define, is a collection of smaller projects. Each of them is responsible for a certain portion of this whole big picture, but overall, all put all together, it delivers a nice middleware abstraction layer that sits between the infrastructure of your choice, be it AWS, be it OpenStack, CloudStack, and by abstracting this infrastructure from the developer console, we can achieve significant benefits that some of them, I would say, important to us as an application developer for servicing many companies is the avoiding the lock-in. If we have built and deployed an app on AWS using Cloud Foundry, shifting it to a private cloud or to another public cloud provider becomes so much easier. So to some people, the Cloud Foundry could be sort of like a bargaining power. If you are a big customer of Amazon, you can always at least have some voice in a conversation because of you are more or less independent and abstracted from the infrastructure. I would let Cornelia continue with the architecture and the Bosch, which is the deployment toolchain, and I will maybe join later.
Great, thank you. So this is a relatively brief talk, so we won't have a chance to go into any of the details on the architecture. And this slide is it's kind of startling, because usually you see architectural slides where things are nicely bounded by boxes and organized in such a way, and this slide is kind of like, wow, everything's out there. But I like this slide because it's really representative of how the Cloud Foundry system works. So the Cloud Foundry platform, if you think of it as an application, a Cloud Foundry application, and you'll see why I make that distinction in just a moment, is itself a very, very complex application and highly distributed. So all of these different nodes that you see here colored in the pink are different components of the system that are likely running on different machines. They could be running on the same machine, but they likely aren't. And there's probably multitudes of each of those. And so how you take a distributed application like that and have those components communicating with one another is actually one of the things that I like about the way that this slide is shown. So let me just briefly go over the primary functions. What we see here in the middle on the left is the cloud controller. So the cloud controller is really the brains of this. This is what's going to orchestrate the deployment of applications, the provisioning of services. When a client from the outside goes to do something with, deploy a new application into Cloud Foundry, they're going to do all the communicating with the cloud controller. UAA is about authentication and authorization, so that's the subsystem that handles that. Over here on the right-hand side is a health manager. So one of the important things about Cloud Foundry is that it includes components that do recovery for you. So it automates some of those things that you would have had to do in your infrastructure when you deployed production applications. That's baked into Cloud Foundry. So for example, the health manager is going to monitor those applications, and when an application goes down, because maybe the server that it was running on went down, or there was some other problem, maybe a network problem, the health manager recognizes that and remediates. It'll restart the application. So that's the role of the health manager. Then over here we have something called DEA, and DEA stands for Droplet Execution Agent. And what that really is this area over here is the container in which your applications are running. So all of the applications are running within that container. I'm not going to talk about the collector and the syslog aggregator. In fact, I'm just realizing that there's another component that I will address in just a moment. But before I get to that, there's two more components that are not in the hot pink. That's the router and NATs. NATs is a messaging fabric, so you can see that when we see these paths that go between the different components, they're either going through NATs or they're going through the router. So they're either using asynchronous messaging through the NATS service bus, or if it's an HTTP request, it's going through the router. Those are components that are included as a part of Cloud Foundry as well, the router and NATs. And finally, there's something that isn't depicted on this slide, and that is the services. So services are really where are going to be things like your databases, or it might be also something like RabbitMQ, where you want to use messaging outside of the Cloud Foundry infrastructure as a part of your application. So in the end, I like this slide because it kind of highlights those various components and does so in a way that shows you really how distributed they are. Now, that's Cloud Foundry. So Cloud Foundry itself is the platform as a service. So what you do with the platform as a service is that you push applications, you bind to existing services. You are not dealing with things at the IaaS layer. You're not dealing with virtual machines and networks and storage. You're dealing with applications and services. That's your unit of currency in the PaaS. Well, how do you deploy the PaaS itself? So we're not just offering cloudfoundry.com as a PaaS that you can come and use. One of the things that we are focusing on at Pivotal is enabling your PaaS strategy even internally in the enterprise. If you think about it, our legacy comes from VMware and EMC, both of which are enterprise companies. So we're really focusing on that space as well. So we want to make it so that you can deploy your own internal PaaS. And that's where Bosch comes in. Bosch is an open source tool chain that allows you to deploy these highly complex, highly distributed applications like this one. You've got lots of moving parts across lots of different machines. How do you coordinate all of that? And that's what Bosch allows you to do. And so one of the key things is that Bosch offers you an abstraction layer over the infrastructure as a service. So Bosch will allow you to deploy Cloud Foundry on top of vSphere, on top of Amazon Web Services, on top of OpenStack. And it has a component, a subsystem within it that allows you to plug in other layers below it. So there's a cloud provider interface that allows you to plug in different things instead of those IaaS options there. So it really does give you the option of doing things internally, externally, and as Renat mentioned, it gives you the opportunity, just having the PaaS layer there gives you the opportunity to move application workloads, but Bosch also gives you the opportunity of having your PaaS be a bit more portable or deployable in multiple scenarios, so establishing a hybrid cloud. This architecture, the Bosch architecture, is similar to what you saw in the previous slide in that Bosch itself is a very sophisticated system, multi-node system, where there's multiple components. You'll notice that there's components that are very analogous to what we saw on the Cloud Foundry side. So for example, there is a director. Just like there was a cloud director, there is now a Bosch director, and that's what we're seeing here. There's a message bus, again, that's used by the different components within Bosch to communicate. There's a health monitor to make sure that the things that we're deploying as a part of Bosch remain up, or if they go down, come back up. So just like in Cloud Foundry, if your application node goes down, the health monitor recognizes it and brings it back up. On the Bosch side, if an entire virtual machine goes down, it recognizes that and will bring that virtual machine back up. So Bosch is really about automating that interface down to the IaaS layer. So it'll do exactly what I just described. A virtual machine goes down, it says, oh, I can't find this virtual machine anymore. It waits a few more seconds, whatever, that's all configurable. And then it says, oh, I'm going to assume that virtual machine went down. I'm going to spin up a new one. Oh, that virtual machine was in charge of these Droplet execution agents. I'll deploy the Droplet execution agent onto it and spin up some new applications on it. So that's exactly what the health monitor does there. And there's a few other components, like worker components, that help you do things like compile things before you deploy them out into the infrastructure and so on. All of that, what's in Bosch is what we call the outer shell, and then what's in the inner shell is the distributed application, which in this case is Cloud Foundry itself. So Cloud Foundry is running on a bunch of VMs. Bosch itself, the deployment mechanism for Bosch, runs on a bunch of VMs as well. So, okay. So, but we're not here just to talk about Cloud Foundry. We're here to talk about Cassandra. This is the Cassandra Summit, after all. So I want to tell you a little bit about some work that we did in exposing Cassandra as a service within Cloud Foundry. So at a very high level, and I'm not going to spend my whole time on slides. In fact, I want to spend most of the time in a demo, in a screenshot, in a screencast that I have. But the way that services work in Cloud Foundry, this is kind of a generic picture for all services, is that we have services that are running on virtual machines that have been deployed by Bosch, and I'll show you that running live. So we have, let's say, the Cassandra nodes that are running in Bosch. Let's say we have a 2-node cluster, and Cassandra's running on those. When we deploy an application to Cloud Foundry, we want to bind to that Cassandra deployment. And we do so via something called a service gateway. And that's what we see down here on the lower part. So requests are made to the service gateway, and the service gateway communicates with the Cassandra installation via a layer called the service node. And that's what you see here. And you can see that there's multiple instances of the service node. So there would be, let's say if we had this two-node Cassandra cluster that I talked about, we would have instance 1 and instance 2. And there's a thin layer that's deployed alongside of the Cassandra itself, and that deployment's done via Bosch, that essentially brokers commands down into the Cassandra system, so that when you want something new from Cassandra, you want to provision something new, that little layer of service node makes those calls down into Cassandra. But from externally, when you're pushing the app, that's all done via the gateway, and the gateway communicates via the nodes via a messaging broker. Okay, so that's kind of the high-level architecture of services in general. Let me now jump over to the demonstration, and let me show you first what we're going to do in that demo. I'm going to show you an initial deployment of a Cloud Foundry system. It includes a 2-node Cassandra cluster. I'm getting my excellent, thank you, good timing. So I'm going to start out with a 2-node Cassandra cluster. Then I'm going to show you how easy it is to push an application to Cloud Foundry. Then finally, I'm going to go back and I'm going to demonstrate how you can use Bosch. Remember, Bosch is the deployment tool. I'm going to show you how you can use Bosch to modify your Cassandra deployment to go from a 2-node cluster to a 3-node cluster. And then I'll show you how all of that works. So let me jump over to that. It's on the desktop. Okay, ready? Okay, so what we see here, and I want to pause this for a moment, I'll let it highlight. So the command that was run at the top of this was a command called, there's a command line interface for Bosch. This is Bosch VMs. So this is showing you all the virtual machines that are being used to run Cloud Foundry. What's highlighted there, you'll notice, is that there's 2 nodes that are Cassandra nodes, and there's also that gateway that I talked about. So we'll let this continue forward. So that shows you what the current Cloud Foundry setting looks like. Now what we're going to do is we're going to be a PaaS consumer now. We're going to do things against that PaaS. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to target the PaaS, and that's what's happening with this target command. So we set, that's to the cloud controller that I talked about earlier. Then we're going to log in, and that's using that UAA component that I showed you in the screenshot. So we'll log in and hit a password. Then what we're going to do is I'm going to show you that we want to see what applications do I currently have running in the system and what service instances do I have running. Well, I don't have any applications, and you'll see in a moment that I don't have any service instances either. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is show you that there are, however, some services available for consumption. So when I do an info with -- services, you can see that there is going to be a Cassandra service listed there. So this is telling me that when I push an application, I can bind it to a Cassandra service. There's my application, so I just showed you that I have a WAR file there. And pushing that to Cloud Foundry is as simple as doing a push command. The push command detects the WAR file, and you have to answer a handful of questions. The name of the application, how many instances you want running of that application. I could have 10, I could have 100, I could have 1. I answer a few other questions about how large I want that system to be. And at the bottom, let me move the pointer out of the way, is the URL for that application. I also answered the question of, yes, I want to bind to a Cassandra service. You can see that there. And no, I don't want to bind to any other services. And you'll see my fancy schmancy application in just a moment. So now you can see that it's uploading. It's starting that application, checking to make sure it's okay. And now we're going to bring the application up. So you can see here my wonderful UI coding skills. You can see at the top there's a little bit of a status message that shows you that we are connecting to one of those nodes. I'll remind you that the nodes in the cluster were 151 and 152. So this time the application is connecting to 151 over port 9160. I'm going to enter a few bits of information and submit that. Of course, I can look up that value as well, and now you can see all of my fancy application coding skills. I spend most of my time on the back end. I'm not a front-end person. Okay, to show you that that in fact wasn't just tied to 151, but it was in fact tied to 150, that it's a 2-node cluster, I'm using the Cassandra CLI here to just go in and show you that data record that we just entered. So there you can see that on 151, you see at the top of the screen that we were able to see that. Now I'm going to go over into 152, and we'll do the same thing. We'll go into that sample key space and sample column family, and we'll see that same data record. And then finally, the last thing that I'm going to do in this stage is I am going to jump over to, preemptively, to another node, and I'm going to try to connect to 153. Now 153 should fail because remember I told you it was only a 2-node cluster. So the 2-node cluster, it's going to fail here, and sure enough it does. Okay, so we've got just a couple minutes left on this video, and that's pretty much what we're doing. So now I've come back over to the Bosch CLI machine, and I'm going to show you very quickly that we're going to edit a deployment manifest. So now we're dealing with Bosch. In the deployment manifest, I'm going to increase the number of virtual machines that I have by 1. So you'll see here that I have 5 virtual machines that fit a particular profile. I'm going to change that value to 6 because I want to add an additional node into my Cassandra cluster. So I add that to 6. Now I'm going to do a quick search for the section in this deployment manifest for the Cassandra configuration. And you can see there that it had 2 instances. I'm going to change that to 3. And then you can also see the range of IP addresses that are used to deploy this cluster. 151 and 152, we're going to change that to 153. So now we're going to have 3 nodes in the cluster. This is literally exactly what I did to change my deployment from a 2-node cluster to a 3-node cluster. So now I'm going to do a Bosch Deploy, which is going to take this new configuration. It summarizes the differences that I made, 5 to 6, 2 to 3, and the range of IP addresses. And now it's going to do its work. So Bosch is going through, and it's provisioning a new virtual machine. It's provisioning the Cassandra bits onto that virtual machine and configuring those into the cluster. And now, when we go back, I'll show you the Bosch VMs, and it'll show you that there's now 3 nodes in the cluster. So you can see Cassandra node 0, 1, and 2. And now when I go back to the CLI, you would see, and I'm going to pause the video here because it's just going to show you in the CLI that in fact I went to that CLI and that data record was appearing in that CLI as well. So I think what we want to do is go back to our slides. And for your benefit, the slides will be available, of course. And there's a couple of screens that are showing you how the staging process works. So the app gets staged, and I talked through a lot of this, but the slides are there for you to remember how those happen. So I talked about the fact that we communicate via gateways to nodes, and we come back, apps get provisioned down into the DEAs. And then finally, the last picture that I want to show, and then I'll let Renat wrap up for us, is that this is a picture that depicts what we just did in the demo, going from a 2-node cluster to a 3-node cluster using Bosch. This just highlights the different places in the configuration where we made changes and how a templating mechanism is used for those deployments. I'll very, very briefly mention in 30 seconds or less that we have this solution that I just showed you is running in a content management scenario that's being built by EMC. This is the architecture. They have a number of Cloud Foundry services that are running. You can see here that they're running Cassandra services, as well as blob stores and an XML database. And then they have application components, different layers of application components running as Cloud Foundry apps in those DEAs. All right, so I'll let you wrap things up here.
And to wrap up, I wanted to comment on the state of the Cloud Foundry service in the upcoming version of Cassandra 2.0. The service portion is getting rebuilt, and I guess as soon as end of August, beginning of September, there will be the new version of the services module that hopefully we will bring the new Cassandra service onto the Cloud Foundry 2.0. And I hope that we'll see you next year here at the summit, and maybe we'll talk about how does it work. Thanks everyone, and it was great to see you. If you have any questions,
We have
yeah.
A couple of things really. In your architecture diagram for Cloud Foundry, it was missing the stager component.
That's right,
yeah,
and that's something that's changing, and I'm going to
Yeah.
very quickly go down.
So that's the new generation.
That's right, exactly. And so this was our very, very last slide, and we had a little snafu there, but build packs. So there was a stager component, and there still is something that's doing some work around the build packs, but something that's coming in Cloud Foundry. In fact, I think we're going GA on that today in cloudfoundry.com. We'll have the new build pack support, modeled after Heroku build packs. And so rather than staging being something that was baked very deeply into Cloud Foundry, it comes via the build pack. And so by staging, for those of you who don't know what staging is the mechanism of taking your application, the WAR file that you saw there, and getting it ready for deployment on the node that's running the Droplet execution agent. And it used to be a fairly involved process that only allowed you to, if you wanted to extend Cloud Foundry with new types of staging for a new programming language or a new framework or something like that, it was fairly involved. And now that's happening via build packs. So, exactly.
And when's migration to Rabbit happening away from NATS?
I don't know.
Because that's a single point of failure in the architecture at the moment. So I know the guy who wrote NATS is kind of trying to create a clustered approach, but it's never kind of completed. So I was hoping that that the work would progress around that one.
There is work in progress. I honestly, I believe that it's going to be more on the latter side. I think that they are sticking with NATS, but there are backlog items that are removing it as a single point of failure.
Okay, that's it from me.
Any other
Great.
questions?
Thanks everyone. Have a good day.
All right. Thank you.